Chinese airlines just cancelled over 400,000 flights to Japan after the remarks of Sanae Takaichi, the new prime minister of the island nation. Here to discuss with me this topic from another perspective is an old friend of the show, Warwick Powell. Warwick, welcome back.
Great to see you again, Pascal.
Warwick, yesterday I had Joanna Lei on the line about this, and she's of course from Taiwan, but from a very pro inner cross-strait dialogue perspective. She gave a couple of insights, and I wanted to pick your brain as well. What is currently happening to Sino-Japanese relations, and why do you think that the Chinese reaction has been as huge as it is?
Look, obviously the relationships have become very tense in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and in large respect, of course, the spark that set off the latest round of intensification and the downward spiral, if you will, in at least the bilateral tone, were remarks made by the new Prime Minister of Japan concerning the Taiwan question. And in the Diet, she was asked a question about her government's posture in relation to Taiwan, and she responded by talking about it as potentially a survival question, invoking the possibilities, the legal possibilities of mobilizing Japan's defense forces in the event of any military incident arising around Taiwan. Now, that, of course, provoked a significant diplomatic reaction from mainland China, and also actually some concerns from various political forces on the island itself. The island itself has a more complex set of attitudes on these issues, but nonetheless, many of the concerns about the latest Japanese intervention are shared across the straits. Beijing, I guess, is highly sensitive on the question of Taiwan, period, for national sovereignty reasons. But in this particular case, I think, Pascal, there is also a much deeper historical sensitivity. I have no doubt that Joanna would have gone through much of the longer history going back to the late 1800s when the Japanese colonized Taiwan and eventually were forced at the conclusion of the Second World War to return all these territories that it had colonized to its former sovereign controllers, if you will. But I think one of the things that is really important to remember is that the Japanese Imperial Army invaded China in 1931 and prosecuted a war there all the way through to 1945. Some 25 to 30 million Chinese people died during that period as a result of that war. And there is certainly a high level of sensitivity and an historical sore point about Japanese aggression, Japanese barbarism, and militarization. Now, when the People's Republic of China and Japan normalized bilateral relationships in 1972 and ultimately issued the joint statement, which of course has been covered quite a lot in the last day and a half, 2 days, on the back of the current crisis, the discussions did involve some contemplation or an exchange around the question of war reparations. And Zhou Enlai, the premier of China at the time, who led these discussions, came to a view that the Japanese people at large, a population of civilians, should not be sort of punished, if you will, by enforcing reparations for the actions of a previous government. And it was part of a negotiation to try to draw a line in the sand, to create a new leaf, to turn a new page on bilateral relationships so that the two countries could, in a sense, move forward together with some of these questions sort of put to one side. And ever since then, there have been 3 subsequent declarations, formal bilateral declarations, communiques, and those sorts of things, that have reaffirmed the intent of drawing a line, the recognition that there is a mutual responsibility and a mutual benefit to finding ways of coexisting, coordinating and collaborating in the interest of each country, but also in the interest of the region. So when we had the Prime Minister make those remarks concerning Taiwan Island recently, it really provoked two things. One was the unwinding of those historic commitments that actually laid the foundations of the normalization of bilateral relationships, number one. But it also opened up the question about whether or not Japan really did sincerely hold the views that were articulated in these various documents concerning not only its relationship with the mainland, but actually its relationship to Taiwan Island itself. And if the Japanese would see that an incident around the island, which the Chinese obviously see as a domestic question, was sufficient to provoke a Japanese military intervention in the name of national security or survival, then that would really mean, as far as China is concerned, that Japan no longer viewed Taiwan or the question of Taiwan as a Chinese domestic question. And that contributes to concerns that there may be efforts to, particularly from the West, to salami slice this question of one China.
I was hoping at the beginning when I heard about what she said in Parliament that what she meant was that a war in and about Taiwan would be a national emergency to Japan, in the sense that, of course, Japan's closest island is like 100 kilometers off the coast of Taiwan. But actually, no, that's not what she meant. She meant really that in case Chinese warships, mainland warships, should approach the Taiwanese island, then that itself is a contingency which Japan might to prevent by using the force of its self-defense forces, which actually is a breach also of the Japanese constitution, according to a lot of people, especially on the left, because the constitution says Japan's self-defense forces can be used in and for the defense of Japanese territory only. And obviously, however you read it, Taiwan, just under no imaginable circumstances, belongs to that, and no Japanese ever claimed that, actually. But from a mainland China perspective, there was just so much that this overthrew, so many expectations also in Japan that this overthrew, wasn't it?
Yeah, look, it came a little bit out of the blue, in part because whilst clearly the mainland had its own concerns and reservations about the new prime minister, evidenced by the fact that there wasn't the obligatory or the conventional congratulatory note. I think the mainland tends to also have a bit of a wait and see approach, mainly in the way that it conducts its diplomacy. It understands that there are many issues that impact North Asia, where Japanese and Chinese coordination and dialogue are actually vital to the interests of both countries. Whether it's in relation to the issues around the stability of the Korean Peninsula, whether it's in relation to promoting regional trade liberalization and opening up market access, economic coordination, alignments around financial buffers, so that should there be liquidity shocks to regional economies, that those liquidity shocks can be properly dealt with through coordinated action from central banks. So there's lots of things. The Japanese and Chinese economies heavily relate, and so a pragmatic approach is usually adopted. But when the Japanese Prime Minister, made these remarks. And I should add also, when she visited Malaysia for APEC, she paid a visit to a cemetery there, and paid her respects to Japanese soldiers who fell in Malaysia during the Second World War. That actually didn't endear herself to people in Malaysia either. And again, it raises these question marks about Japanese militarism and attitudes towards that. Now, I think it's fair to say that the majority of people in Japan, and certainly the feedback that I get from friends and colleagues who live and work there, they certainly do not support a remilitarization of Japan in the ways that the more extreme elements of the Japanese body politic tend to sort of think about these things. But that said, there are some concerns that the current Prime Minister comes from that part of the body politic that tends to have, firstly, a more aggressive posture towards Japanese remilitarization, certainly reflected in comments about the nuclear question, and also I think reflected in the fact that she has, in times past, actively articulated views that really seek to question the critique, if you will, of Japanese barbarism and hostilities during the Second World War, to a point where she has been involved to some extent in historical revisionism. So, as a package deal, I think she represents a particular set of attitudes and forces in Japanese society which are of concern to people on mainland China, to quite a lot of people on Taiwan Island, and also to people in Southeast Asia. So I think when you package all of that together, the reaction was actually incredibly predictable, incredibly understandable, and from what I have heard, there is now an effort to try to find a pathway back to normalization that obviously doesn't involve total humiliation, because that's the trick of diplomacy, but at the same time compels the Prime Minister to, at a certain level at least, to recognise that her remarks really overstepped the historical norms. Let me just say one last thing, and this perhaps works a little bit in her favour, and that is that we know that in politics and in international affairs, it is often necessary for leaders, whether they are the absolute top leaders or senior ministers, to mind their words and often calibrate what they say in a way that perhaps doesn't necessarily reveal fully their own personal views, of course, but also the official views or the unofficial views of people within a government, but nonetheless can convey a signal. And they do this because the norms of diplomacy really require a certain level of decorum and good manners, if you will, so that it gives room for everybody to navigate complex issues. And so, in some respects, she's only been Prime Minister for not even a month. And whilst she holds these strong views, so I think her articulation of the views is seen as very sincere. They do reflect her views on a lot of things. There is a little bit of slack, not a lot, but a little bit of slack on the basis that perhaps she didn't quite understand the obligations that come with being Prime Minister, to watch your words more carefully.
I think your observation is a very important one. I wonder how much how much slack in that sense China is willing or can cut her. But I just want to I mean, the circumstances under which she said this were very, very particular, because it was in response to a question from an opposition lawmaker, and an opposition lawmaker from the left-wing party, from the Constitutional Democratic Party, and that's the party that wants her to restrain that, who doesn't want to go militarist, who have been always anti-militarist. And his question, and he kept drilling down, he kept asking her several times, so would that constitute it, because he wanted her to say no. But then she said yes. Plus, what you just said is what actually Prime Minister Abe did. Whenever he was asked about this situation with Taiwan, he always replied that he will not speculate on matters of this importance. He always said that. And she actually used that same sentence, or a similar sentence, at the beginning of her reply. But when the dude started drilling down, she at some point said, like, yes, actually it would. So in a sense, one of my Japanese friends interprets this as, it slipped, because yes, she believes it, but she also knows that there's a balance to keep. But now the problem that she created is that in order to undo the damage, you'd have to take it back, but that would damage her right-wing coalition because they are now cheering, right, the nationalists, and that support is something she needs because she's in a minority coalition government, so she cannot alienate that wing, and she put herself into, like, into a real pickle, actually.
Yeah, look, I think that a lot of this has to do with domestic political dynamics because obviously, in the way that she became prime minister, there is no basis of a broad mandate yet. That would require going to a general election. And so, in a sense, she perhaps felt a need under pressure to demonstrate her mettle, particularly to the constituency that backed her into the position. Now, again, well-seasoned politicians remain very disciplined, particularly on issues that you do know are likely to provoke not only very, very strong reactions, but arguably create risks that they cascade out of control. And I mean by that, the possibility of triggering downstream events that you actually can't anticipate. Now, from the point of view of a national government, the last thing you do is make decisions when you are fully in the knowledge that you don't know what will happen thereafter. That's a highly risky and arguably an incredibly irresponsible thing to do. And I think in that intense environment, and being questioned in the Diet is of course a certain theatrical intensity. It's the nature of the beast. It can lead people to lose control, but also you can see how the pressure of the moment can provoke people to respond in ways that perhaps with cooler heads prevailing they wouldn't have. And perhaps again in that context there is going to be a modest amount of slack. China's not going to let this one go easily, in part because of the substance of the issues, right? But I also think that the error, if you will, from the position of Japan, and you touched on these other islands, some of those are disputed, as we know. And within days, we've now had Chinese Coast Guard ships move through those disputed waters. And notwithstanding some protests from the Japanese government has actually not been able to do anything about it. And 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it's highly unlikely that something like this would have happened. So what she may have inadvertently given rise to is the pretext by which a new normal is established. And I'm sure that that's not the outcome that she would have wanted, but it's certainly one that Beijing will take with both hands.
Yeah, I mean, what I worry about is that this kickstarts an escalatory spiral, which actually, on both ends of the spectrum, helps those who argue for more military engagement in finding a solution. Because I very, very deeply that the Japanese will not fully comprehend the nature of this backlash that's now coming. Although, do you think that the intensity and also the very public nature of this backlash, really, like with like 400,000 tourists and travelers canceling their flights? I said at the beginning it was the airlines, but it's the tourists who cancel their flights and the airlines who reimburse them because of the policy, that this will show Japan that, okay, this is a hornet's nest that we need to understand better.
Yeah, look, I mean, clearly there are some issues unleashed, the hornet's nest, the Pandora's box, where deep-seated feelings that people have can be mobilized very, very quickly. But obviously, people also wanted to visit Japan, so there is clearly an open-heartedness at the same time, right, in other ways. So I think many Chinese people do have complex relationships in relation to the Japan question, and uh, by and large, are not only willing to let sleeping dogs lie, but are actually happy to look forward, right, as to what the future is as far as the relationships are concerned. And of course, from a personal point of view, to be able to visit a country and enjoy all the things that Japanese society and history and nature and all those things has to offer a tourist, as well as Disney, of course, if you've got kids. And so, but there is clearly a potential economic blowback, and the Japanese economy is not in great shape at the moment, and the relationship that it has economic with China remains a very important part of Japanese economic well-being, and so I think that there is going to be a lot of pressure, and there is no doubt that the new government is actually acutely aware of it. A special envoy was dispatched, met in Beijing yesterday, Tuesday. Footage has circulated, of course, of the envoy leaving the offices. No comments have been made from each side yet. What that suggests is that there have been some very heart-to-heart, direct discussions, and which now are being conveyed back to the leadership for some appropriate thought. I have no doubt that whilst, as I mentioned, China is not going to let this one go lightly or easily, is also able to work with the Japanese side, if you will, to create the conditions for an acceptable cooling down of the situation. And again, it's the pragmatism. There's not much gained from continuing to heat this issue up if you can find a way to cool it down sooner rather than later. And if there is a way, and if the Japanese government is open to that, and quite clearly I think there are some signals that they are, then I think Beijing will be very open to essentially working with the Japanese to find a way out for the Japanese. What it will do, though, is, as I said, I think it actually creates a new normal. And the new normal is combined with the shifting attitudes on Taiwan Island, the fact that the mainland, the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Coast Guards went through the contested island waters. They won't be going back on that. And what that really does is that it demonstrates once again that not only does the People's Liberation Army have the capacity to circumnavigate the island of Taiwan itself, but it actually has the capacity to push that little bit further.
I mean, the danger in this situation is, of course, that both nations, mainland China and Japan, they both have the capacities to actually, to do each other very real damage. But so far, the norm has always been that the islands under administration of the other one will be approached, and you will make a scene, but you use water cannons. No, they never used water cannons against each other. That's in the Philippines.
No.
But there's very clear discipline also on not showing guns, for instance, on these boats.
Yeah.
You always keep them hidden and so on, and you have very, very clear norms of engagement. So you're expecting a change in these norms of engagement, actually.
I think probably more in terms of frequency, first and foremost, because in fact there is nothing that that the Japanese can do about it. And they opened up the space for China to say, look, you've indicated that you may treat the Taiwan question actually not as a Chinese domestic question, but as something else. And therefore, we need to be much more mindful of that part of the world now in the interests of national sovereignty. So yeah, now it will be. I think you're absolutely right. These little the code of international engagement that will be adhered to, and I think the parties, Japan and China, are actually very, very competent at understanding these signals, because in many Asian societies, a lot of communications is done in very polite ways and often slightly oblique ways, where you have to be very attuned to subtle indications rather than someone just directly telling you something. So I think that the sort of cultural sensitivity to the way in which these coded communications work exists. That's actually a good thing, because these subtle messages will actually get through. And but I think a new normal is being established.
Yeah, and it also needs to be said that, of course, although the heads of the government in Japan changes frequently, the ministries they stay, and
Yeah.
the directors stay, and the entire apparatus stays, and that apparatus is very, very attuned at trying to read the apparatus in China and vice versa. So you're absolutely right. There's the stability there won't necessarily go away, but on the political level, this incident now created the necessity for China to put its foot down and foot down very, very strongly to say, like, this is it, this internal matter. But on the other hand, it creates a problem for the pragmatists also in Beijing, because the harder the foot comes down, the stronger it actually pushes Japan into even further into the arms of the United States. And the United States has been suspiciously silent on the entire thing. I mean, the only one who wins, actually really wins from this spat between Tokyo and Beijing is actually Washington.
Well, Washington did withdraw some missiles out of Japan in the last few days, last week or so as well. So, look, I think that there's a lot going on here, right? The Washington does want, I think, its partners, allies, shall we say, to step up a lot more in terms of this broader strategy of China containment. The reconfiguration of Washington's approach to this has seen Washington push its regional partners into minilateral arrangements that also try to insist that their regional partners increase expenditure, buy more machines, munitions, and weapons of war, and that their partners take a more active frontline role. It allows Washington, in a sense, to calibrate its own resource constraints whilst making others do the heavy lifting. And I think we see that in Japan, to some extent Korea as well, with the nuclear submarines, the situation in the Philippines, and also, of course, where I'm located here in Australia. So Japan, in some senses, is, of course, playing a very useful proxy role for that broader recalibration of American strategy, even if the objective remains largely unaltered. I think under her predecessors, there was an attempt to perhaps exploit this window of, greater, let's call it greater autonomous responsibility, to build some capacity that may enable Japan to be a little bit less under the thumb, so to speak. But I'm not quite sure that the current Prime Minister necessarily has that sense of what this opportunity is. The behavior and the discussions and the obvious visual relation, the relationship between the Prime Minister and President Trump, I think, suggests that there is an affinity that is a little bit different to just how her predecessors tried to calibrate their relationship to the United States, which was much more balanced, right? Which is, okay, we're part of this alliance. The US has military bases on Japan, but at the same time, the US wants us to do more. So we're going to exploit that as an opportunity to become a little more independent. I'm not sure she's doing that. Look, I think the other thing that this does, Pascal, and this goes back to the question of Taiwan, is that it's actually a very, very powerful and opportunistic opportunity for anti-separatists of all hues, whether they're static, whether they're unifiers or what have you, to become more aggressive in their campaigning, their messaging, their rhetoric, their attempts to persuade, people in the political sphere, the political elite, on the question of Taiwanese reunification, to re-engage more sensibly and concretely with the mainland. The recent election of the new chairwoman of the KMT has, I think, added a real spark to that particular aspect of the Taiwanese political environment. And this incident gives that part of the political world in Taiwan, I think, something really to work with. Because you've got to remember that there has been for about 25, 30 years an attempt to, in a sense, de-Sinify Taiwan. And to some extent, there's been a leaning towards the legacy of Japanese occupation as part of the cultural legacy, etc., etc. But this episode actually enables people to remind people in Taiwan that, in fact, their heritage is deeply Chinese.
Yeah, and just let's recall again for anyone who who might still be confused on this. I mean, the official name of the government of Taiwan is Republic of China. Let's just recall that, right? Because in Western discourse, this is pushed so far aside that you would be forgiven to think that there is something like a Republic of Taiwan. There isn't. It's only a Republic of China. But you also alerted me to the fact that, and this is going to be two questions. One, there's this link of the current ruling party, the Democratic DPP, Democratic Pacific Party in Taiwan, to try to reach out also to the Israel lobby and to build more connections with the United States through that. That's one. The second question, if you have time for this, why do you think some parts of Japan's defense posture has much more to do with North Korea than with China? For instance, the whole missile issue that Japan 2 years ago changed its dogma, saying like, oh, we will not just shoot down missiles incoming, but we might also shoot at the missile launch bases. That was taken as an escalation also from China, but it is actually mainly 95% of cases that the Japanese are thinking about is North Korea. Why is it that isn't there a window of opportunity for China to help to build regional stability through regional security dialogue? Because if China helped Japan to ease its fears vis-a-vis North Korea, that would actually quite make an impact and help Japan quite a bit. And I'm not saying to defang North Korea. I'm saying to build like common forums to discuss, because the Japanese don't have the same ability to talk to the North Korean ministries as they have with the Chinese ones. Sorry, two different questions.
That's
you
okay.
choose which one you want to go to.
Look, I'll deal with the Lai Ching-te question first, which is the leader on Taiwan. It is true that in the last month or so, he has been quite explicit in seeking to create alignments between his own political imperatives and those of the Israel lobby, AIPAC, both through a visit that AIPAC made to Taipei recently, where they were hosted and treated as very, very important guests, and but also through very explicit utterances about how he views the Israel experience from the point of view of becoming a porcupine, defensively, as really the model, the military model for Taiwan itself, and those outreaches to the Israel lobby, I think, are very, very interesting, because it actually suggests that he and his allies domestically on the island are concerned that Washington may not be as strong a natural supporter that perhaps it once was. But he understands that the Israel lobby holds tremendous sway over those inside the Beltway, and is seeking to exploit that. Now, the risk that he runs, I think, in doing that is that it will alienate a lot of people across the region, number one, but also alienate a lot of people on the island as well, who find what's going on in the Middle East, in Gaza and elsewhere, to be, well, beyond distasteful, who are appalled by the ethnic cleansing that has
Genocide.
been prosecuted. I wasn't sure whether we could say that, because I
Yes.
didn't quite know what the algorithm would do.
It won't do anything. It's fine. Like the majority of the world population knows it's a genocide and talks about it. Yeah.
And so I think that that level of alignment from Lai Ching-te with the Netanyahu administration in Israel, and also with AIPAC as a way of trying to influence Washington, runs the risk actually of undermining whatever standing he still holds on the island itself. And that, I think, added with the new KMT chairwoman and these other events that we've been actually trying to unpack in this discussion is it opens up a new episode, perhaps, of cross-straits dynamics that simply was not conceivable even a year ago, where there are now serious people talking about a need for Taipei and Beijing to again have meaningful dialogue about what the world will look like tomorrow and in 10 years' time. Now, there are reunificationists, of course, on the island, but there are people who are not reunificationists who are nonetheless seeking some other kind of peaceful settlement. Now, those voices had been really sidelined for probably the best part of the last 8 or 9 years. But I think these recent events give impetus for those voices to come back to the fore, and it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds, both because of the dynamics in Washington itself and, of course, more regional ones. Look, I think the question of the DPRK is hugely important. It's unfortunately poorly understood by many in the West because it's just painted as the rogue, state, the hermit kingdom, all that sort of stuff. But it is clearly a very important part of the regional security architecture, or the lack of an architecture. It's a nuclear power. It has the capacity to deliver nuclear-armed warheads transcontinentally. It can't be ignored. And it is understandable that countries in and around the region, with the histories involved, have concerns. It's in the interest of everybody that some kind of understanding and détente can be arrived at that allows them to have fewer fears of others within the region in terms of their impact on security. And I think you're right that Beijing is in a position, incidentally, together with the Russians, who have a refreshed military or security arrangement with the DPRK, to ultimately lead more constructive dialogue in the region. The current moment's quite difficult, of course, because of what's happening in Ukraine. It makes it difficult for American allies to engage with Russia without the rest of the world jumping on their case. How dare you talk to Moscow, even though Moscow is actually an important player now, as insofar as the North Korean question is concerned. Because don't forget, Russia also stretches over above North Korea all the way to the Pacific coast and the Kamchatka Peninsula. So Russia, Beijing, DPRK, 3 nuclear powers that can't be ignored. And I think Japan needs to come to its senses. It will in time need to address the question of whether or not it can genuinely have security for Japan in the region whilst there are American troops located in Japan. Now, that's not a 5-year question. That's a 10, 20, 30-year question. But until these issues are progressively addressed, Japan's going to be, I think, always on some tenterhooks. It would be wise, I think, for Japan to, focus on priorities. The island of Taiwan is actually not a survival question for Japan at all. The DPRK is, and the DPRK question is better handled if you have the ability to work with China and with Russia to find ways of having dialogue with Pyongyang. Meddling in Taiwan is not a very good way of achieving that.
It's not. I keep thinking that the key to Northeast Asian security and stability might actually be in Mongolia, which has a fantastic relationship with everybody, including the Russians, and could invite for a sub-director level security dialogue among the ministries of defense, and probably they would come. Anyhow,
any excuse to visit would be grabbed with 2 hands. If there's any opportunity for me to tag along, I'd love to.
I'll keep thinking about that. But Warwick, thank you very much. Is there anything that still needs to emergent discussion on this one, or do you think we've covered 80%?
I think we've covered the sort of big picture issues that we're aware of, and hopefully helped shed a bit of light on what the dynamics are and ultimately what the real priorities are. Japanese involvement in the question of Taiwan is simply not a Japanese priority. There are many other bigger issues that Japan needs to be reflecting upon and dealing with. And in fact, China is part of the solution for many of these issues for Japan and for the region at large, for really obvious reason. It's the biggest economy and the most powerful nation in the region, and you don't resolve regional issues if you don't engage with them constructively.
I'll try to find a Japanese expert to talk about this as well. Warwick Powell, thank you very much for your time today.
Absolute pleasure, Pascal.